This is a lecture for History 370, Modern East Asia, Section 5, Fall of the Qing and the Rise of the Republic. Our objectives for this section are to understand the difficulties China faced following the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, to understand China's responses to those difficulties, and also to understand why the serious government efforts at reform were too little, too late. We will also try and understand why the Qing fell, and that is connected to the government's efforts of reform being too little, too late. We will also try and understand why, despite all the hopes that many Chinese people put in the new republic that they established after the Qing fell, this new republic would fail to hold China together. We need to do a little bit more review, though, before we continue. And one thing you may remember, a long time ago, I talked about this battleship called the Dingyuan. And that is a model that you can now purchase and assemble if you want. And the Dingyuan, you may recall, was this kind of battleship, early form of a battleship, I should say, that the Chinese had purchased for their navy, right? The Qing purchased this for their navy. And this is one of the battleships that they're going to lose to Japan in the Sino-Japanese War. Now, they had a lot of confidence with this new battleship and with the strength of their navy. You may recall that in the Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese had 0 battleships. The Chinese, however, had 2, one of them being the Dingyuan. And so the Chinese were very confident. And to give you a sense of that confidence, in 1884, when the Dingyuan was visiting Nagasaki, an important port city in southern Japan, the Chinese sailors and other soldiers accompanying them behaved very poorly, leading to rather massive riots in Nagasaki. And these were, it would seem, were primarily the fault of the Chinese who were engaged in them. And the Japanese were not able to get the Chinese to really give them even any kind of apology despite coming into their country and starting riots. And this shows, in a sense, the confidence that the Qing put in their naval vessels and in their power, and how in 1884, 10 years before the Sino-Japanese War, Japan did not feel it was strong enough to stand up to China. Right, so this incident in which Chinese sailors behaved poorly and the Japanese were essentially not able to do anything about it in 1884 was made possible by this kind of Chinese confidence and Japanese fear of the power of China. However, a mere 10 years later, Japan felt that it had enough confidence that it was able to provoke a war with China over who would have predominant influence in Korea. And not only did Japan win that war, we have to emphasize it won that war rather easily. China did not win a single battle, and China was forced to pay Japan a huge amount of money and give Japan territory. So in just that decade, things had changed, and we want to emphasize the impact that had on the Chinese. It was one thing for the British to defeat the Chinese, or the British and the French working together to defeat the Chinese, as happened in the Second Opium War, which we didn't talk about too much in this class. Those were Westerners. It was recognized that they had this industrial power and so forth. But Japan, that was a different story. The Chinese, like the Koreans, had traditionally looked down upon Japan. They did not take Japan seriously, as we saw in the Dingyuan incident. And for the Japanese to beat them rather easily, that was a tremendous shock to the Chinese. And it really told them, you know what, something's wrong. All right, there is something seriously wrong with what is something people would argue about, right? Is it something wrong with the Chinese people, with the Chinese government, with our economy, what? There will be differences of opinion about that. But it was understood that there is something fundamentally wrong and that there needs to be change, right? This basically discredited self-strengthening in the minds of many Chinese. For many Chinese, there was an understanding that we need to engage in serious, deep reform, right? Because we just got defeated by this power that just a decade before was clearly behind us, but now is in just after 10 years is able to defeat us so quickly. So we're not even really catching up. We're just falling further and further behind. How do we fix things? In order to understand the problems with the attempts to reform China during this time period, is we have to remember that China was a part of the Qing Empire. Right? China was a part of the Qing Empire. And the Chinese, Han Chinese in particular, it's complicated about what it means to be Chinese, but for now I'm talking about the Han Chinese. They form like 95% of the population, but they're ruled, as part of the Qing Empire, by the small group of Manchus who are a tiny, tiny, tiny minority. Now, in the early period of the Qing dynasty, they had some powerful rulers. But during this time period, there's going to be a lot of weak emperors, and that leaves a kind of power vacuum. The Chinese system of government is based so much around having a strong, powerful person on top. If you don't, you have a power vacuum, and someone's going to rise up and fill that position, or things are going to fall apart. Right? Things are going to fall apart. And what's striking about this time period is that the person who is going to rise to the occasion, in a sense, is a woman named Jishi. Right? So it's a woman who's going to be, in a sense, guiding the Qing Empire during this difficult part of its history. And as we'll see, she has some issues that have unfortunately made her into a kind of villain, as we'll talk about later, to many Chinese, right? So it's kind of sad, right? We have a woman who's actually wielding power, but as we'll see shortly, she's going to end up being treated something as a villain in Chinese history. Now, the way she got to power was this. She was an imperial consort, initially, meaning she was one of the emperor's many women who had some kind of official relationship to him. She bore him a son. When the emperor died, her son came to power. And that's not to be surprising to us, but he was young. So she acted basically as a kind of what we would call an empress dowager. Empress dowager means the mother of the emperor. And she acted as regent for her son. Now, her son was a young boy, so she ruled for him, basically. He died while pretty young. He was still, I believe, in his teens when he died. I think 18 or 19 years old. And then what happened, as the Empress Dowager, she could choose who the next emperor would be. And she ended up choosing one of her nephews, who, surprise, surprise, was a small child. So what this means then is she can rule through these people. Right? She initially has her son as the emperor. She can rule through him. Then her nephew. And basically that is how she's going to govern, typically. Right? She's going to govern because she has some close relationship to an emperor. Now, considering the situation, things could have been worse. Because one thing I want to emphasize about this woman, she was really smart. And she was very politically adept. And you can kind of think of her as somewhat similar to Empress Myeongsung of Korea. Both, in a sense, are conservative. They're not looking for radical reform. But they're also very, very intelligent, strong-willed women. Her basic approach was to support some self-strengthening while maintaining the power of the Manchu within the Qing Empire. So when self-strengthening, she was all for it as long as it helped the Qing keep power and did not threaten to hurt the Qing. Right? And this points to one of the reasons why to many Chinese she's kind of a villain today, because she is not a Chinese nationalist. When she asked, how can I, when she understood these problems that China faces, and she wants to think about reform, her priority is not trying to fix the Chinese nation, it's trying to save the Qing dynasty and the state that the Qing dynasty rules. And that's a slightly different perspective. If you're Han Chinese, you think about how do you save the Han Chinese nation. And you can think about a Han China without the Manchu, without the Qing. She cannot do that. For her, there is no future for China unless it is a part of the dynasty, the Qing dynasty, and the state that the Qing dynasty governs. Right? So there's a fundamental difference of opinion. So what this means is this. Some Chinese are willing to undertake radical reform because it will help the nation. It will help make China stronger. She, however, will oppose that radical reform because while that radical reform might make the Chinese nation stronger, it threatens to weaken the Qing dynasty and the Qing state, which govern over the Chinese nation. So there's a fundamental difference there, and that's one reason why, despite her many talents, as we shall see, she's going to often stand against reform. And that's one reason why many Chinese look back at her and don't like her. An example of a reformer who would oppose her is a man named Kang Youwei. And what's interesting about Kang Youwei, he was a Confucian scholar who was from Shandong province, which is very close to Beijing, so very important politically, but also one thing that's fascinating about Shandong was that is where historically Confucius was thought to be from, right? So it has a certain kind of prestige in China. And what's interesting about Kang Youwei, and this makes him different from the self-strengthening people we've looked at before. The self-strengthening people like Zheng Guofan, they understood what was good for the Qing dynasty being good for China. That's why they were willing to support the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty stood for traditional Confucianism. They believed in that. They were willing to support it through these self-strengthening measures. Kang Youwei is a little bit different because what he does is he tries to develop an understanding of China that does not have Confucianism at its core. For people like Zheng Guofan and the traditional Chinese Confucian thinkers, being Chinese fundamentally meant being Confucian. And you could not separate the two, right? You could not separate the two. But he argues that actually Confucian culture was something that could be changed. You could change it if it promised to help the nation. So he can envision a China in which Confucianism is not, as it was understood then, was not the center. And in particular, what he did is he thought, I can take out the Confucian stuff that is hurting us. For example, the Confucian distrust of merchants. I could take that out because Confucianism is not the center. The Chinese nation is. And then that will allow us to change the culture to save the nation. Right? So we can keep the Confucianism stuff, we can keep that stuff in as long as it helps the nation. If it threatens to hurt the nation, such as Confucian prejudices towards merchants, let's toss it out. So he fundamentally wants to change the culture to save the nation. So this is a big deal, right? This is a major shift. People like Zheng Guofan thought, oh, we need to restore our culture and maintain that culture through self-strengthening. But Kang Youwei says we need to change the culture, and therefore by we can save the Chinese nation. He is going to write then a book called Confucius the Reformer, where he argues that Confucius was not fundamentally a traditionalist who said he had everything right. Rather, he argues Confucius himself was a reformer. He acknowledged that he was a reformer, and therefore it's okay for us, like Confucius, to reform things. Confucius, he argues, was someone who was willing to change things to make life better for the Chinese, to strengthen the Chinese nation. So we can do the same thing. We can also change things in order to make things better for the Chinese nation. Now, that doesn't mean Kang Youwei was against the Qing dynasty. Like Zheng Guofan and the self-strengtheners, he saw the Qing state as, with a powerful emperor, as capable of bringing those reforms. He wants a strong Qing state with a powerful emperor at top who can force those reforms through. Right? A powerful emperor can bring reform. That's what he wants. You can see why that's going to put him on a collision course with Cixi. Right? Cixi wants a weak emperor who she can control, and then she can follow policies that are relatively limited in order to make sure that the Qing dynasty maintains its power. Kang Youwei emphasizes the Chinese nation, wants a powerful Qing emperor in order to change China and the Qing Empire to benefit the Chinese nation. So you can see how there's going to be conflict between them. Now, Kang Youwei will attract the attention of the emperor, Cixi's nephew, in this time period, and become his advisor. And he'll bring in a lot of his buddies who have ideas like him, and they will convince the emperor to issue a variety of reform edicts. The emperor will declare that the exam system needs to be made more practical. It shouldn't just be based on the Confucian classics anymore. It should focus more on practical issues of government. He will order the establishment of modern schools. He will order the increase of production, such as industry and trade. And he will also want to modernize the government and its infrastructure. Now, here's the thing. These basically stay edicts. They don't lead to much practical advantage because there's not time. It's called the 100 Days of Reform because it didn't last very long. Technically, it lasted 103 days. I have a Chinese student who would correct me whenever I said 100 Days of Reform, but that's what's known as because that's easier than 103 days. But the key thing is, didn't last long. Cixi saw these reforms as weakening the government and threatening Manchu power. Right? She saw these reforms as weakening the government and threatening Manchu power. So she will order that the emperor be arrested and will order the arrest of many of the reformers, and many of them will be executed. Kang Youwei, by the way, manages to escape to Japan, where he establishes the so-called Protect the Emperor Society, which wants to try and basically bring powerful emperors back to China, to the Qing, so they can bring the reforms he wants. So you can see right there the fundamental problem that China faces. There is a need for reform. They just got torn apart in the Sino-Japanese War. However, any efforts at bringing real reform threaten the Qing dynasty and are therefore crushed. Right? Anything that promises to threaten traditional ways and values are crushed. And we'll talk more about how those things are threatening and why later on. Now, what's also going to happen during this time period, because since Japan was able to defeat China so easily, everyone knows that China can be beaten up on. Right before this, a lot of people took China very seriously, said this is still a country to be reckoned with. But after Japan defeats China, Britain, France, to a lesser extent the United States, and of course Japan, who we've been talking about, realize that China is very, very weak and they can beat up on China. So there's going to be a scramble for what are called concessions. And basically concessions are things like the right to build a railway in China. So you would have the Americans and the British come in and build a railway. We build it where we want it to go, and the profits are going to go to us, not necessarily to China. And China is too weak to stop this. They're too weak to prevent foreigners from coming in and gaining influence and power over vital infrastructure such as railroads and over things like telegraph lines and trade and stuff like that. So this just shows how weak China is. And they're in this terrible situation where it doesn't even look like they are going to be able to reform. One area that is particularly problematic for the Chinese is Qingdao, right? Qingdao. Qingdao is in Shandong province. And you can see it's very close to Beijing from that map. And like I said, this is the area where traditionally Confucius is thought to have come from. So this is a very important part of China. And during this time period, this is a very famous image on the left. This is a French comic depicting how China is being divided up. And you can see there's the piece of bread or pizza. I'm not sure what it's supposed to be exactly. Pie, I don't know. But in any case, the European powers and Japan are dividing up China there. And there's this Chinese official behind them who can do nothing to stop them. And you'll notice that there is one figure who is actually stabbing a knife into the Chinese pie or whatever it is and is starting to cut it. And that represents Germany. So Germany is also going to be expanding into China during this time period. And in particular, as we'll talk about momentarily, the Germans are going to be expanding into this area known as Qingdao, this very important area in Chinese tradition because that is where Confucius is historically thought to have come from. Now, I should point out that some German influence here, of course, is good. I mean, how can you look at this picture and say this is a bad thing? I mean, this is awesome. The Germans came into China and taught the Chinese how to make German beer. That is awesome, right? And here's some Chinese celebrating this German connection with a kind of traditional German clothing and German beer. So that's a kind of good, positive foreign influence, right? Sharing the treasures of the world, such as beer, good German beer, with the rest of the globe. However, not all German influence was so welcome. So one thing that occurred was that there became German missionaries who were active in this region. And two Catholic priests who were German missionaries were actually murdered in this area in 1897. In fact, this is what was used to justify seizing control over Qingdao. And this kind of thing happened, and you can see how that there would be kind of friction and difficulties because basically anytime something happened like this to foreigners in China, their foreign government would use it as an excuse to expand their power into China. So in 1897, 2 German missionaries are murdered by the Big Sword Society. This is an anti-foreign secret society established by Chinese peasants, who we'll talk about momentarily. And Germany can take this instead of just saying, hey, you need to punish the guys that killed them. Germany will say, well, in exchange for killing these 2 missionaries, you have to give us control over this territory. And basically in this little area of Qingdao, I shouldn't say little, it's fairly large, the Germans are given control and allowed to engage in mining, They're allowed to build railways. And here's the thing that's really, really important. In order to protect those mines and those railways and German citizens, two of whom had just been murdered, they're allowed to station troops, right? They're allowed to station soldiers. So this is itself a problem. Right now, you imagine this. Imagine if all of a sudden in South Carolina, the French were allowed to start mining and building roads wherever they wanted, and then they brought in French soldiers who could make sure that they could do whatever they wanted. Right? That would be a problem from our perspective. In addition, remember, like I said before, this is the province where Confucius, the central figure of traditional Chinese civilization, came from. So the Chinese resisted this. They protested. At times they fought with the Germans, right? Chinese peasants did not want to sell their land to build the railway. They were afraid that the German building of mines and things like that would mess up the irrigation system and so forth. And this led to fighting at times, and the Germans responded. They had those soldiers there with violence. And this occurred at times, the basically massacring civilians, including women and children. So this got very, very nasty, right? This got very nasty very quickly. And this is going to feed into kind of broader Chinese frustration with foreign influence. Shandong was an area where there was a lot of friction. But all throughout North China, there were these kinds of issues. Right? There was growing foreign influence. It was impacting more and more on the lives of Chinese outside the cities. And this led to a certain kind of resistance. What made things even more problematic was that there was a drought in 1898. There was a serious drought. And droughts are kind of tricky. They're, of course, terrible because it means that you're going to have problems with your crops. But unlike other natural disasters, droughts are a non-event. A drought is when something doesn't happen, right? It doesn't rain. And it doesn't rain for like a long time. That's the nature of a drought. And so you sit around saying, well, what am I going to do? Right? There's nothing really to do, right? There's a drought. I'm a farmer, but I can't actually farm because there's no water. So what happened was a lot of young men got together and started practicing martial arts and forming organizations like the Big Sword Society. And they got together and they said, I wonder why it is that there is a drought. I wonder why that is. And some people said, you know what I think? I think the gods are punishing us because we're allowing these Christians to come into our country. They teach that there's only one God, but we believe in many gods and we worship our ancestors. China and Koreans and to a certain extent the Japanese practiced ancestor worship. And these Christians say we're not supposed to do that. So these Christians are coming into our country and they're disrespecting our gods, and they're converting our people to become Christians. So now Chinese people aren't respecting their gods. The gods are angry at us. And that's why it's not raining, right? It's not raining because we've allowed these Christians into the country. We've allowed them to influence people and to convince them to depart from the true way. So what will happen is you've got all these guys who are martial artists who are fighting and trained and they're farmers. So they've got farm tools. They'll just go around and start killing Christians. They will massacre both foreign missionaries and Chinese Christians. And what will happen is sometimes it will actually start raining after they kill the Christians, and they'll say, aha, see, we were right. The gods were angry at us because we allowed these Christians to be here. Let's keep killing them because this is bringing the rain back. Keep it up. And the Chinese government, for the most part, doesn't really do anything. The Chinese government refuses to really take action to intervene to stop this. And at times, Chinese government officials will actually help with the massacre of Christians and foreigners, right? Even foreign people who aren't engaged in your missionary activities, such as diplomats, they will also be massacred. But despite this, right, you've got Chinese people going around killing foreigners, killing Christians, and the Chinese government doesn't seem to want to do anything about it and is even helping kill these people. So what will happen is foreign troops will start intervening and start attacking Chinese, and they will even attack some important fortresses called the Dagu forts that basically defend the approach to Beijing. So at this point, the Qing the Qing Empire, basically Qixi, the woman we talked about previously, decides to declare war on 8 countries. Right? She's decided she's going to declare war on countries like, and I'm not going to be able to name all 8, but like the United States, Great Britain, France, Japan, Russia, Germany, the Austrian Empire, and Italy. And I should point out, she actually declares war on 3 other countries, the Netherlands and a couple others, but only 8 agree to fight back. Now, why do they do this? Basically, this was the only card left that Cixi had to play. The only thing left she could do was trust in the power of the people. If you do not want radical reform, if self-strengthening isn't working, it was her hope that the peasants, because there's hundreds of millions of them, would be able to rise up and kick out the foreigners. Right? She hoped that they could rely on the power of the people, united with the dynasty, to be able to overcome the foreigners. And they will engage in things like attacking the legations, right? And that's a big deal. Legations are basically like embassies, they're diplomats. And in Western culture, Western civilization, you do not hurt diplomats, right? Diplomats are to be respected. But what will happen then is this what really makes the rest of the world, or I should say the other empires, angry. And so you'll have this establishment of what's called the Eight-Nation Alliance, and they will come in and within a very short time just utterly defeat the Boxers. I mean, remember, the Qing had not been able to defeat the British alone. They hadn't been able to defeat the Japanese alone, but now they're facing like the Japanese, the French, the British, the United States, Austria, Italy, Russia, and Germany all at once. They just get destroyed. So this attempt to rely on the power of the people utterly fails. And the Europeans, the Americans, and the Japanese will wreak a bloody vengeance. They will in turn massacre Chinese, including civilians, because they say, look, the Chinese did it to us. We need to teach them a lesson to make sure this never happens again. And they will engage also in a huge amount of looting, massive amounts of looting of Chinese cultural treasures, as well as just flat out wealth like gold and silver. And in order to get them to stop, basically, the Qing Empire has to pay 450 million taels, that's ounces of silver, to the Eight-Nation Alliance, to those countries. That's almost twice their annual budget. Right? So in order to get the Western powers to back off, and Japan as well to back off, after losing this Boxer Rebellion, the Qing Empire has to pay 450 million taels, about twice its annual budget. So finally, only now, is Cixi willing to agree to undertaking radical reforms, right? And that's symbolized by this picture here. There you can see the Dowager Empress Cixi surrounded by Western women and a Chinese girl in Western dress. And she would engage in these kind of public relations efforts to try and show that the Qing were willing to modernize. And they are going to undertake some real reforms. In 1902, they will launch compulsory public schools. This will eventually serve, by the time the dynasty ends, this will eventually lead to the establishment of like 50,000 schools and almost 2 million students. So they do a pretty good job in some ways. This is a little bit behind the times. They're 30 years after Japan in doing this, but they did do it. In 1905, they decided to abolish the exam system, those Confucian exam systems that we talked about. We talked about all the important roles they played, but it's decided that those things are no longer needed, that they need a new way to select officials who are modern and interested in reform. This turns out to be kind of a problem because this weakens the support of the conservative Confucians, right? You may recall that there were some Confucians who were willing to support the Qing because the Qing did support Confucianism. Now, they don't really have a good reason to support the Qing because the Qing no longer supports Confucianism. In 1905, the Qing established a commission to study to develop a constitution. So right in 1905, they commit themselves to studying constitutions. They send like a group to Europe, and they also examine the Japanese constitution. And they choose to adopt the Meiji Constitution, basically. They say the Meiji Constitution looks good. We'll basically make a few changes and adopt it. However, they will delay it, right? So they agree to adopt the Constitution, but they delay its implementation for about a decade, so it will never actually be implemented. The dynasty will fall. So they're engaging in some real reforms. And I would argue that if they had engaged in these reforms, say in the 1870s or 80s, when things were relatively good, they would have been in much better shape. But as we'll see, these reforms are much too little too late. Chinese have already become radicalized. Then in 1908, Cixi dies. And this is a big problem because after she dies, there is simply no one like her among the Manchu who can fill her role. This woman was just brilliant when it came to politics, and she could be ruthless, And as we discussed earlier, her main interest is not the Chinese nation, it is the health of the dynasty. All that being said, though, she was competent. She could be corrupt. We talked about her marble boat earlier, right? Spending money on that instead of spending money to build up the Navy. But in any case, there was no one who could replace her. There was no one who could hold together the empire like she could. And that's going to be a big, major problem. But that being said, the Chinese, under the Qing Empire, have now decided they're going to go the route of some democratic practices. Remember, we talked about that was a revolution that did help bring a country's strength. So, for example, in 1909, they will establish local elections in which men are able to vote. Now, just like in Japan, there were requirements that dictated who could vote, right? There were property requirements and things like that. And in China, only 4 out of 1,000 could actually vote. But still, it's the beginnings. It's saying that voting is important. That can expand later. And they actually will have elections, national elections, in 1910. Now, these are not for legislators like the U.S. Congress. These are elections for assemblies that are mainly to give advice. They can't pass laws. But still, you've got this idea of voting, and you've got this idea that we have to listen to the people. In addition, the Qing will attempt to modernize the army. And I mean really modernize the army. I don't mean that they're going to try and establish basically just some arsenals and just buying some guns. They're actually going to try and build a modern army, right? One that is trained in modern ways, not just using modern weapons, but actually follows modern military ideas. They will also try and centralize the railroads. That they realize the importance of the railroads, and instead of trying to prevent them from being destroyed or prevent them from being built as they had in the past, they're actually going to try and build them themselves. All of this stuff is kind of going to blow up in their faces, as we shall see. It's unfortunate that the Qing finally decided to do, in a sense, what needed to be done so late, because it's too late for China, as we'll see. It's also too late for the Qing.